I'm Stephanie Rentz from the English department. Before we get started tonight, I want to remind you to turn off your phones, something that I think I forget to do more often than not, especially when I'm teaching a class and then the phone goes off. One announcement, next week we have the writer Stephanie? Alessandro Grist is going to be giving a reading as part of our Working Writers series on Wednesday at 7:30 p.m. in this exact spot. I also want to encourage people, I think the word is starting to spread, but I'll go ahead and put a plug in here to submit to the Purple magazine, the student literary magazine. You should start, there's a reading on Valentine's Day, and you should start to hear word about deadlines. And so you should definitely get your work in to them. So it's a pleasure to welcome Laura Vandenberg tonight to give the Vocation of the Writer talk. I want to thank the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture, especially Tom Landy, whose support makes this talk possible. I don't think Tom is here yet, but we'll give him a round of applause afterwards. I'd also like to thank the Creative Writing Program in the English department. Oliver de la Paz is our leader this year, who's done a lot of the legwork for this reading, and also Elise Sod, who's the administrative assistant in the English department, and she keeps us all organized. So Laura Vandenberg was born and raised in Florida. She's the author of 2 collections of stories, The Isle of Youth and What the World Will Look Like When All the Water Leaves. And she's also the author of 2 novels, Find Me and The Third Hotel. Laura has many, many, many honors, including the Rosenthal Family Foundation Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the Bard Fiction Prize, a MacDowell Colony Fellowship, a Civitiella Ranieri Foundation Fellowship, a Pushcart Prize, an O. Henry Award. There are countless others. She's been twice shortlisted for the Frank O'Connor International Short Story Award, and all of her books have been included on many best of lists. She teaches at Harvard University and in the MFA program for writers at Warren Wilson College. I've had the lucky opportunity to read through Laura Vandenberg's impressive body of work over the past couple of weeks. That's the great thing about having someone come to visit. You have an excuse to read things that maybe you wouldn't make the time for. Many of the stories were familiar to me because I'd first encountered them in Best American Short Stories and the O. Henry Prize stories. Reading a whole book of them over the course of a few days, which was how quickly I had consumed The Isle of Youth, made me see what a singular original vision Vandenberg has. Her stories seem to be set in our world, in a world that resembles ours, and yet not quite. In an interview that appeared in 2013 in Vice, Vandenberg was talking about her sensibility as a writer, and she said this, quote, "I think where a writer falls on the realism, non-realism continuum has a lot to do with their sight, as in, this is how I see the world. And it seems my sight is off-kilter and kind of strange, but I come by that naturally. I'm not consciously pushing towards a particular point on that continuum." Once I read that, I thought, yes, that's absolutely true, because there is a kind of strangeness in Vandenberg's fiction that never feels gimmicky or attention-grabbing, that always, at least to my readerly taste, tells us something important and true about how lonely and weird it can be to be a human trying to get along with other humans in our world. Thus, for example, when the narrator of I Looked for You, I Called Your Name, which is the first story in her second collection, when this narrator who's on a honeymoon from hell in Patagonia, goes to the beach in the middle of the night and packs her mouth with sand, which is a very odd thing to do, I found myself thinking, yes, of course she does that. As far as action goes, it was off kilter and surprising and weird, certainly, but it also seemed like the perfect way for the story to express the narrator's choking anger with her husband, who's kind of a dolt, along with her growing awareness of the compromises that we make in relationships. Later on, that narrator will look back on this moment and she'll marvel at the fact that she acted inexplicably and didn't have to explain herself. as though life since her marriage unfolded has required one explanation after another. Vandenberg's work often revolves around a mystery, but her mystery plots quickly fray and unravel, revealing that the real mysteries exist in our everyday lives. This is nowhere more evident than in The Third Hotel, a noirish, a novel that you can buy after this reading, I should mention, a noirish novel set in Cuba about a widow named Claire who thinks she spots her very recently dead husband killed in a hit-and-run accident at a film festival where he was supposed to present a paper on horror movies. Claire begins following him, and though at first it seems the novel will be a ghost story or a whodunit or even a zombie tale, it eventually becomes a dreamlike and at times nightmarish meditation on the ways that people who love one another also stubbornly remain strangers to each other, and the way that the grief that follows losing those whom we love. As Claire says, I have to read this line because it's so beautiful. Claire at some point thinks to herself, death could make a person feel righteous in a way they had no right to be. Nothing in the world was less personal, and nothing felt more like a poison arrow sent straight to the heart. So please join me in welcoming Laura Vandenberg, who's going to talk about being a writer. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here at Holy Cross. Thanks for coming out, and thanks to the English department and the creative writing program for hosting me. And thank you to Stephanie for that very generous and lovely introduction. So my plan this evening, I've written a talk about stuff pertaining to writing in one way or another. And I'm going to read it. It's about 25 minutes, and I'm going to do very short, like less than 10-minute reading. And then if you have questions, I'm happy to do my best to answer them. Does that sound okay? We're amenable? Great. This talk is called Unboxing and Heisenberg, Some Thoughts on Process, Uncertainty, and the Writing Life. And I should say, when I was taking the train up from Boston, I realized with horror about halfway through the train ride that I forgot my reading glasses. So just forgive if I'm reading like this, forgive me. This essay is in 5 parts. Part 1, jumping rope. Last year, my therapist told me that I was in desperate need of a hobby, and so I decided to take up boxing. At my first class, we were instructed to begin by jumping rope for 5 minutes. No problem, I thought. Who doesn't know how to jump rope? As I fetched a rope, I searched for a clear memory of myself jumping rope as a child and started to feel panicked when I could not retrieve one. Before long, I was convinced that I had never learned to jump rope at all. I couldn't get through one rotation without getting all knotted up and having to start over. After a while, I had a little more success with the 1 foot at a time jogger style. Maybe this will suffice, I thought. That is until the coach caught sight of me and remarked, "That's how my daughter jumps rope." True story. "That's how my daughter jumps rope. My daughter is in the 2nd grade. Are you in the 2nd grade?" I shook my head. "Then pick up your feet." I tried. The rope caught me like a net. The coach sighed and walked away, pausing to nod approvingly at another student's crisscrosses and double unders. Later that week, I brought home a jump rope of my own. I announced to my husband that this was part of my new humiliation avoidance plan. I would teach myself to jump rope properly. How long could that possibly take? I started to practice in our apartment, and then, after receiving a noise complaint from our downstairs neighbors, on the concrete slab that sits in the middle of the small backyard behind our building. For days, I couldn't get more than 2 or 3 rotations in a row, and even those took tremendous effort. My feet were lead heavy. Afterwards, my shins ached. I would pass playgrounds while walking my dog, spot school children skipping rope with ease, and feel a wild and gnawing envy. I started to worry that I was truly incapable, that I was afflicted with some kind of jump rope specific deficiency. But then one day I did 10 rotations in a row, and then 20, and then 50, and then 100. I watched YouTube tutorials on different jump rope styles and took it all back to the concrete slab. When I managed a proper jump rope technique at the gym for the first time, the coach paused in front of me, raised an eyebrow, and then kept circulating. There was, mercifully, no longer any mention of the second grade. The questions that I hear the most frequently from my undergraduate creative writing students almost always begin with the word how. How do you know where to start a story? How do you know where to finish one? How do you know what to do in the middle? How do you know if what you're writing is any good? How do you know whether your character should marry her high school boyfriend or set a house on fire or die tragically in a hiking accident? How do you recover from realizing the story you've been working so hard on might be unsalvageable? How, in essence, do you keep the faith? At the start of her craft essay, That Crafty Feeling, Zadie Smith offers the following disclaimer, quote, I should mention that what I have to say about craft extends no further than my own experience, which is what it is, 12 years and 3 novels. I would like to offer the same provision now in that my thoughts on craft and process are bound by my own experiences. And, of course, there are no definitive or empirically correct answers to the how questions raised by my students, so I can only tell them what I believe to be true, that I believe in process, that I believe in the cumulative impact of labor over time, that I believe in being alert to the world and its many mysteries. Part 2, what is process? In boxing, they tell you to always listen to your corner, which amounts to listening to the people to whom you've entrusted your training. For example, if your coach tells you to stay busy, to work your job, you don't argue, you listen, and then you do. For a writer, the idea of a corner is often more abstract in nature. Our corner might well include a mentor whose advice we trust or readers whose opinions we value. Our corner almost certainly includes people we have known, the parts of ourselves we seek to reach when we are writing, and a pantheon of other writers and artists, living and dead. In the words of John Edgar Wideman, quote, I am my audience, not in an egotistical or narrow-minded sense. I read a lot. I think a lot about my mother, my brothers, aunts, and uncles. I think about Ishmael Reed reading something I write. I think about William Faulkner reading something I write. I think about Virginia Woolf reading something I write. In my head, there's this whole Congress, this whole auditorium. It includes my mother, T.S. Eliot, Jose Saramago, every place I've been, all the people I've known. That's what I relate to when I write, end quote. When we are fortunate enough to peer into the inner lives of other writers, especially the writers who belong to whatever pantheon we hold dear, through published notebooks or letters or interviews, we see that student writers are not the only ones wrestling with those questions of how. Take this excerpt from a letter written by Flaubert, quote, you don't know what it is to stay a whole day with your head in your hands, trying to squeeze your unfortunate brain so as to find a word. Ideas come very easily with you, incessantly, like a stream. With me, it is a tiny thread of water. Hard labor at art is necessary for me before obtaining a waterfall. Ah, I certainly know the agonies of style, end quote. Or this bit from the ever-cheerful Kafka. January 29, again tried to write virtually useless. The past 2 days went early to bed, about 10 o'clock, something I haven't done for a long time now. Free feeling during the day, partial satisfaction, more useful in the office, possible to speak to people. Severe pain in my knee now, end quote. I recently shared the Flaubert passage with a student who was struggling with process, with uncertainty and self-doubt, and she promptly exclaimed, if Flaubert felt useless at his desk, then what hope do I have? Fair enough. And yet it is worth remembering that so many writers all throughout history have had to navigate these questions of how, these questions of process. Questions that are complicated by the fact that process is not just what we do or don't do when we sit down to write. Process is also about how we live. Part 3, other questions my students ask me. How do you write what you don't want anyone to see? Maybe the real question is, why write something that you would want everyone to see? The anxiety around not wanting a particular person, or perhaps any kind of person, to read what you're writing suggests to me that something is being risked in the making. The writer is putting something on the line, something is at stake. Perhaps it is a matter of potentially revealing unflattering information about a person you care for, the kind of ethical question that writers must reckon with on a regular and case-by-case basis. Perhaps there is the worry your work will change the way people see you, the assumptions they might make. Perhaps you are worried the work is starting to change the way you see yourself. Regardless, these anxieties can become an invitation to seek out the root of what the fear is truly about. If, for example, on the surface the fear feels connected to judgment or the shattering of a particular kind of privacy, we can work to understand the deeper, messier, uglier tendrils that give the fear such depth and stick. And then, once we understand, we can confront. And then, once we can confront, we can maybe not vanquish, but make the fear small enough to not derail the writing and, more importantly, the living we must do. This, too, is process. Another question. How did you know you wanted to be a writer? And what happened after? In my sophomore year of college, I enrolled in a fiction workshop with a hope I am now more than a little embarrassed to admit that it would be an easy A. Then I read Amy Humple's short story, In the Cemetery Where Al Jolson is Buried, and emerged from the last paragraph a slightly altered person. I had no idea what I had just read. At the time, my idea of a good read was the latest copy of the National Enquirer, which is to say I had read very little literature, period, and almost nothing contemporary. I did not know that one could aspire to write short stories. In my professor's office hours, I kept referring to the story as a tiny novel until I was eventually and gently corrected. All I knew was that I wanted to keep reading stories like this, which eventually made me want to try my hand at writing them. Humple's story, in sum, sparked in me a longing to exist in the world in an entirely different way. As I recount this experience, I'm worried I'm making it sound a bit too much like an instantaneous conversion, too swift in the implication of transformation, when in fact the process of turning away from the person that I was and towards a person capable of writing fiction was and remains a far more arduous journey. At that moment in my life, I was not, shall we say, the very best version of myself. This is the part I don't get into with my students, but that I will get into this evening because I feel it is salient to the matters at hand. As a young person, I was reckless and dishonest. I often felt hopeless. I could be cruel. I was afraid of everything. I feel as though writing rescued me, not because the work gave me a sense of purpose and a future I actually wanted to move into, though it surely did those things, but also because I started to see that in order for my work to improve, it would become imperative for me to shift the way I related to my surroundings. On the page, I started to perceive a shallowness, a lack of imagination, an unkindness that said a lot about me and nothing substantive about the world. There was also a great deal I was avoiding, and the silences I didn't yet have the skill or the nerve to rupture registered as evasion on the page. Wanting to be a writer would mean, and still does mean, embarking on a long struggle to open myself to the world, to cultivate alertness and patience and a capacity of failure, to do the uncomfortable work of learning to become more honest with myself and others, to be vulnerable, to be present, to be here. I want to take care to not conflate artistic growth with moral growth, especially given the long history of writers who are brilliant on the page and abysmal in person, as we know from published journals and biographies and the aggrieved memoirs of writers' children. In Sigrid Nunez's novel, The Friend, the narrator, a writer herself, observes that, quote, if reading really does increase empathy, as we are constantly being told that it does, it appears that writing also takes some away. In my case, I don't think writing made me a better person, but rather embedded in me over time a greater feeling of responsibility for how I lived because I had charged myself with the task of narrating some very small corner of the world, writing it down, creating a record. In Joy Williams's essay, The Uncanny Singing That Comes from Certain Husks, she writes that writers, when they're writing, live in a spooky, clamorous silence, a state somewhat like the advanced stages of prayer, but without prayer's calming benefits. A writer's awareness must never be inadequate. Still, it will never be adequate to the greater awareness of the work itself, the work that the writer is trying to write. The writer must not really know what he is knowing, what he is learning to know when he writes, which is more than the knowing of it. The writer doesn't want to disclose or instruct or advocate. He wants to transmute and disturb. He cherishes the mystery. He cares for it like a fugitive in his cabin, his cave." End quote. When I first read this essay as an emerging writer, my initial response was something along the lines of, "What the hell?" Yet, Uncanny Singing is now a piece I revisit often as I have found the questions Williams poses to be useful lighthouses as I move through a creative life. How to better sit in that spooky, clamorous silence, how to refine that very specific kind of awareness Williams speaks of, how to cherish mystery. This, too, is process. One last question. How do I know if writing, more specifically my writing, still matters in the year 2019? Should I spend my time doing something else? Yes and no, no and yes. Speaking for myself, if my house were on fire, I would hope for someone to show up with a fire hose and not a novel. Which is to say, there is, most especially in times of crisis, no substitute for direct and immediate action, as opposed to the more circuitous action of creating literature. At the same time, I believe writing matters deeply in our now for the same reason it has mattered to many other nows. To start, I don't think we can overlook the history of how art has helped people survive deep suffering. In the opening chapter of Create Dangerously, the immigrant artist at work, Edwige Danticat recounts how, during Papa Doc's dictatorship, the members of a book club, young men and women, staged in their homes and in secret a reading of Camus' play Caligula. And this is a sort of longish quote from that. They needed to be convinced that words could still be spoken, that stories could still be told and passed on. So, as my father used to tell it, these young people donned white sheets as togas as they tried to stage Camus' play quietly, in many of their houses. The legend of the underground staging of this and other plays, clandestine readings of pieces of literature, was so strong that years after Papa Doc de Boulier died, every time there was a political murder in Bel Air, one of the young aspiring intellectuals in the neighborhood where I spent the first 12 years of my life might inevitably say that someone should put on a play, end quote. Of course, not everyone's background includes the profound repression and silencing that Danticat is describing. Yet even if the experience of living under a dictatorship is far from your own lived experience, as it is from mine, the historical relationship between literature and survival is still one to be taken seriously and respected. I would also argue that even for those of us who are raised in and continue to live in relative privilege and safety and comfort, the concerns of literature do not concern us any less. In speaking about his own process, the poet Chen Chen talks about arriving at a moment when it is clear, quote, that a draft's problem isn't so much craft-based but emotion-based, as in, I have to ask some harder questions. If I had to define my understanding of process in one sentence, perhaps this would be the sentence I would choose, as in, I have to ask some harder questions. Writing demands deep self-honesty from us, even if we only bring that self-honesty to the page, though hopefully we can learn to carry it into other spaces. Everything I have ever written that I still feel is worth something asked me at one point or another to reconsider, if not to altogether reimagine, a closely held belief or feeling. This is often difficult work and a process I've resisted and denied and sometimes still struggle against. This is a lot to ask of ourselves when we sit down to write, but this is what, at a certain stage, becomes necessary. The work of looking very closely, of asking those harder questions, is then made more challenging by the culture at large, which tends to actively discourage this kind of examination. The culture at large wants us to remain rigid, entrenched, and siloed. The culture at large does not want us to ask in a serious way, how did we get here? And even more pressingly, the culture at large does not want us to recognize how long we have been in the here we're presently in. In a recent interview, Alexander Chee mapped out what is, to my mind, a compelling description of how fiction can function. Quote, I think what you can do with fiction is you can look past yourself, past the moment, into the whole crazy scheme that is built up around the lives of your characters, a culture, a government, a history. And you can see deeply, hopefully, into it and into how you have been shaped and how the people around you have been shaped by things that you may have never even guessed at, end quote. The purveyors of American myths, from the myth of a post-racial America to that of the self-made man or woman, to the myth that people can transcend poverty simply by working harder and applying themselves, do not want us to see the schemes that fiction has the unique power to uncover for us, those schemes that keep us lodged in the here we have been in for so very long. The purveyors of American myths want those structures to remain invisible so that they can be denied. I believe that worthy fiction reveals something that matters to and belongs to both the individual self and the human collective, that has something to say about our condition, each writer in their own mysterious and idiosyncratic way. How have we managed to be here so long? How have we managed to progress so much and so little? How does a life arrive at a particular moment of splendor or tragedy? What schemes have we participated in, both knowingly and unwittingly? What structures have made it possible for each of us to be here, in this room? What structures threaten to suffocate us where we sit? What structures threaten to suffocate the person sitting next to us? This, too, is process. Part 4, the blank page. One of fiction's great benefits to us as writers of fiction and also as readers of fiction is the invitation to dwell in uncertainty. How certain we feel we must seem so much of the time. I am up here giving a talk, after all. Even as I ask questions of the audience and of myself, surely I'm supposed to seem certain of something. At times we are speaking with certainty because we have strong convictions, a clear sense of our values. At other times, we might feel as though we must perform sureness so our positions are visible, or so people will take us seriously. When I first started teaching, for example, I was not so much older than the students I was tasked with instructing, and terribly anxious as I was about being taken seriously as a young woman in the classroom, would have been aghast at the notion of standing before a class and saying, I don't know, or let me give that some more thought and we can pick up the thread next week. I'm not sure what I think yet. There might even be times where the introduction of uncertainty stands to radically upend our frameworks for understanding, though sometimes such upendings are necessary for both artistic and personal growth. In literature class, a collection of the talks Julio Cortázar delivered at UC Berkeley in 1980, he speaks about Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. Quote, you reach the very peak of research in math and physics, and a territory of uncertainty opens up where things can be or not, where the mathematical laws don't apply as they do on the lower levels. This interested me a lot because it's exactly the same process that occurs in certain literature and poetry. Just when you reach the limits of expression, just beyond begins a territory where everything is possible and everything is uncertain. At the same time, there is that tremendous force that some things have, and without revealing themselves, they seem to be signaling to us, gesturing to us, so we go looking for them and meet them halfway." End quote. I believe that this is the exact wedge of existence we are seeking when we write. That space where everything is possible and everything is uncertain. And we are attuned to the tremendous forces that seem to be signaling us, beckoning to us across time and space and history, even as we don't know why or how exactly we will, in Cortázar's words, meet them halfway. The blank page is the great equalizer for writers. It does not matter if you are a student writer or a Nobel laureate. You will face the blank page every time you sit down to work on a new project. You will be asked to accept or deny that invitation into the not knowing for as long as you continue to write. In this way, we are all starting over, all the time. The only thing experience can give us, perhaps, is a greater willingness, an understanding that uncertainty isn't something to resist, but rather a necessary vanishing into a secretive and unknown forest. Part 5, my first time sparring. Before I sparred for the first time, I had big ideas about all the moves I was going to make once I was in the ring. I would whip out the Lomachenko-style pivots I had practiced during footwork drills. I would throw my favorite combos on the bag, a hard jab, an overhand right, a left hook to the body. It's like so clear in my mind. I would slip and roll, bob and weave. There is a saying in boxing that goes, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. And in reality, it was all I could do to not get hopelessly trapped on the ropes, do some basic catching and blocking, keep my hands up. After one round, I could hardly breathe, and my left arm felt like it had been set on fire. I felt as though I had forgotten everything I had learned, and to add insult to injury, apparently I wasn't in as good a shape as I thought I was in either. At the end of the session, the coach told me a story about how, after an old student of his sparred for the first time, she burst into tears afterwards, not because she was hurt, but because she had been made aware of what a daunting amount she had left to learn. I took this as his way of saying he thought I might cry too, and was perhaps relieved that I had not. "Anyway, it seems like you handle frustration okay," he said. "You have no idea," I replied. "I'm a writer. I will basically be frustrated for the rest of my life." He said, "Come back next week." When I think in terms of calling, of a life's work on the page, this is what it boils down to for me. Come back next week for eternity. Which is to say, we keep showing up for our work, our current and future projects, which means we keep showing up for ourselves, which means we keep showing up for honesty in all its forms, which means we keep showing up for our communities and our country. We show up for the not knowing. We seek the territory where everything is possible and everything is uncertain. We show up for the daunting amount we still have left to learn. We show up for the gaps in understanding and accomplishment that we can close gradually with labor and with time and with greater awareness, and also for the gaps that will remain forever open. In reading words from people who knew Dennis Johnson after his death, I was surprised and then not to learn that he was a frequent and public crier. In a remembrance from the writer Kelly Luce, a former student, she recalled how, quote, "On the first day, he told us he was a crier. But we shouldn't worry. It usually passed quick. He cried 3 times that semester, one over Mavis Gallant's The Late Homecomer, once over how hard writing is always, but how beautiful to get it right, and one, I forget. One day he brought in 2 metal balls and made us all hold them and decide which was heavier. The difference in weight was very tiny, but we found we could usually tell the heavier one if we didn't think about it too hard. Dennis was delighted by this. We spent an hour holding the balls. He was practically bouncing off the walls with excitement at how much more our minds knew than our brains. His joy and sorrow were on the surface. He didn't give a shit about hiding them. So many of us hide them in public and call them back when we write, as if they will continue to respond. Now I remember the 3rd time Dennis cried. He was talking about what makes a story interesting, how it's the little things, how all the tricks we try as writers are often bullshit. And he wells up with tears and says, "There's nothing more fascinating than watching a guy trying to untie a knot from his shoelace. Nothing," end quote. Johnson's inclination towards crime became less surprising after further reflection because that exceptional sensitivity, the profound and unwavering awareness, the deep capacity for wonder is present even when Johnson describes characters in the most wretched of states. Even then, there is still the young man who knows every raindrop by its name. There are still clouds like great gray brains. There is still the light that peeks out from under a closed door like a slab of brilliance that radiates as if, by some stupendous process, diamonds were being incinerated in there. I have been seeing my current therapist for a year and a half, and I have yet to cry in her office. One of my New Year's resolutions is to cry more. This, too, is process. Or, in the words of Thomas Transtromer, because who says any of this stuff better than the poets, I'm going to end this talk with an excerpt from Transtromer's poem, Romanesque Arches. Tourists have crowded into the half-dark of the enormous Romanesque church, vaults opening behind vaults, and no perspective. A few candle flames flickered. An angel whose face I couldn't see embraced me, and his whisper went all through my body. Don't be ashamed to be a human being. Be proud. Inside you, one vault after another opens endlessly. You'll never be complete, and that's as it should be. Thank you. So because I was talking so much about process and uncertainty, I thought for my reading I would read from a completely new story, still in progress, and I'm just going to read the first handful of pages, and I'll start at the beginning. So there's nothing you really need to know. And in some ways, it's sort of it's personal and not. The characters and the events of the story are completely fictional, but it's the locations is like very much tied to the neighborhood I grew up in Florida, which has a really weird like residential motel sort of smack in the middle of a block that my sister still lives on. And this story is called Slumberland. I spent that summer driving around at night and taking photographs because I could not stand the sound of my neighbor wailing through the walls. This neighbor lived in the apartment above me, and when I passed her in the stairwell, she looked perfectly regular. But at around 10 o'clock at night, she would start carrying on, and her uncorked sadness had a physical effect on me. My skin itched, my teeth ached, a clear liquid leaked from one of my ears. Once, I even got a nosebleed. I wondered if our other neighbors could hear her and if anyone had knocked on her door or called building management to complain. I did not knock on her door or call building management to complain because I did not want to confront whatever was happening in my neighbor's apartment. I wanted only to get away. The apartment complex I was fleeing was north of Orlando, situated between the Deltona Lakes and the Seminole State Forest. My life there seemed provisional, even though I had no immediate plans to move, and so it felt natural to wander. As I drove around looking for things to photograph, I added up what little I knew about my neighbor. She had lived in the apartment complex for 6 months. I did not know her first name, but from the mailboxes, I knew her last, Novak, unless that name was left over from the people who had lived there before, which was possible. Until this whaling situation, I had not paid particularly close attention to the mailboxes. My neighbor had a shoulder tattoo that spelled out something inscrutable in dainty cursive lettering. I often passed her hauling swollen bags from Dollar Tree up and down the stairwell. I had no idea what she did for a living. We had never really spoken, just waves and nods. She used to have a cat, but a few months after she moved in, the cat vanished. I remembered seeing signs in the laundry room, a photo of a black and white cat, the offer of a meager reward. Things my neighbor did not know about me. I have taken photographs all my life. My first camera was a Kodak. I used to make my living as a wedding photographer, but after I moved into the apartment complex, I migrated over to pet portraiture. There was a surprising amount of money to be made in photographing German shepherds in bow ties. Plus, no one ruins their life by getting a dog. When I ran out of facts about my neighbor, I cataloged the subjects I'd photographed so far: a sinkhole, roadkill, the molten night air and all the near invisible things floating through it, the sidewalks still damp from afternoon rains, the long, dark arcs of hallways, highways, fluorescent lit parking lots, malls. There was a specific and terrible sadness to the malls, those places where people went to give in to their loneliness. Sometimes I photographed human beings, a man sleeping under the scant shelter of a bus stop, a waitress smoking a cigarette outside an IHOP. Sometimes I parked in an unfamiliar neighborhood and walked around with my camera, my armpits dripping under my shirt. That was how I got the mother and son, haloed in the warm light of their kitchen. The mother was kneeling in front of her son, who looked to be about 6 or 7, and dabbing ointment on his forehead with her pinky finger. So precise, so tender. Their house didn't have front lights or a fence, and so to get this shot, I crept onto their lawn, moving in a squat like the creature of the night I was becoming, ashamed of how much I enjoyed it. If apprehended by the mother, I could have said, "I had what you had once, or a version of it, and I long to visit that lost world." When my phone buzzed at odd hours, I knew it was my sister sending me WhatsApp messages from Kyrgyzstan, where she lived with her girlfriend because they were both in the Peace Corps. "How are you?" she would ask, and I would feel the weight of all her unspoken questions, the questions she probably discussed with her girlfriend late at night. Nearly ready for bed, I would message back while stopped at a red light. If my phone buzzed and it wasn't my sister, then it was WhatsApp sending me strange spam messages, people asking for prayers or money or both. That summer, I got the same message, "Pray that we get the duplex," so frequently that I started thinking of the sender every time I drove past a duplex, whoever they were. Parking and walking was also how I started photographing Slumberland, a motel at the end of a residential street, and my old neighborhood near Lake Monroe, an area I had not been back to in some time. The lodgers, mostly women checked in for extended stays, tended to look either like they had just arrived on Earth or like they had been stuck in this motel for all eternity. Back when I lived in the neighborhood, every week it seemed some distraught woman was standing on the pitched roof and threatening to jump. This would set off a predictable series of events. Someone would alert the manager, who would stand out on the sidewalk in front of the 3-story craftsman with a wild yard and a drooping porch. He would light a cigarette and gaze up at the woman with utter boredom and say, "Go right on ahead, it won't kill you." After that, he would go back inside, and the woman would stand very still, looking a little stunned, and then scramble up the roof and through the 3rd-floor attic window, which was how they always got up there in the first place, all of them agile as cats. I used to think that this manager had missed his true calling as a hostage negotiator. Whenever I ended up at Slumberland, I checked to see if there was a woman on the roof. Then I photographed the old-fashioned neon sign, the name spelled out in cursive lettering like my neighbor's tattoo, and the black cat that hunted lizards in the ferns by the entrance. I crept around the building to see if anyone had left the blinds open on the ground floor, and if so, what was happening in those rooms. Once I got a woman trimming her bangs with nail scissors. Sometimes I had the feeling that someone was creeping up behind me, even though it was usually me who was creeping up behind someone. Moments when I would feel the air thicken all around and the hairs on the back of my neck would rise up like antennae. Yet when I spun around to look, I would find only a half-lit sidewalk, an empty car, silence. Across the street from Slumberland stood a sprawling white Victorian on a double lot sunk deep in the rot of foreclosure. One night, when I was prowling around Slumberland with my camera, I caught movement over there, 2 slim shadows slipping through the larger shadow of the Victorian. I darted across the still street and snuck around the back, where I observed the cutting beam of a flashlight and 2 teenagers, a boy and a girl, pressing each other down into the grass. The light disappeared. One of them must have switched it off, but it was a clear night, and in the moonlight I watched as they shed their clothes effortlessly, like dogs shaking off water. Their faces came together, and then their bodies, and that was when I started taking photos. Later, when I clicked through the images in my parked car, the windows rolled tight and fogged, the radio at blast, my heart hammering. The teenagers looked like quicksilver spilled in the grass. Was it better to die with a pillow under your head or stretched out in the grass? That was the kind of question that could preoccupy me all night, the kind that caused my sister and her girlfriend to worry, because he had not died with a pillow under his head. He had died stretched out in the grass. A dare, a climb, a fall, that border between magic and annihilation crossed. These photographs are my best work, and no one will ever see them. And I'll stop there. Questions? Yeah. We don't have to talk about literature. We can talk about boxing or dogs or voyeurism. Yeah, well, I mean, I think inspiration is huge, you know, and I do. Can I see who's played a sport of any kind, like with some level of seriousness? So many of you have, right? And it doesn't necessarily have to be a sport, but just tried to learn something that was challenging in some way. And I do think I think inspiration is vital. I also have a kind of like grind leads to magic approach to it. So it's sort of like I really could not. I mean, I literally could not jump rope. I was like, how is this possible? But it is. And then I practiced and practiced and practiced, and then all of a sudden, like one day I could do it. And then once I could do it, I could sort of get better at it. And I don't think it's so. I mean, that has a sort of more kind of clear-cut mechanical process to it. Of course, I think with making literature, there's a lot more, there's the variable of mystery involved to a greater degree, like no doubt. But I do think that there are some similarities where, you know, you sort of stay in the trench of this process and it leads you to this place of kind of deep inspiration that you couldn't necessarily have just arrived at. I think often, you know, if we see movies about artists, we very often have that kind of false trajectory of like, there's a little struggle and then maybe they get like real drunk and then, maybe more than once, and then you know there's like Philip Glass score starts getting, you know, looming, and then they're like working furiously, and then it's like they've done there, right? But that's like very truncated. It's like a 5-minute montage. So I think for me, there's this. Truman Capote really hated Jack Kerouac and really hated On the Road. And when asked about that book, he said, that's not writing, that's just typing. And particularly at the start of a new work, there are totally times when I feel that way. I don't feel like I'm writing in the sense that I'm making something. I really do feel like I'm just typing. And there is that kind of like, it does feel like a little bit like I'm in the grind stage. I'm not yet to the magic. But for me, I only get to the writing if I keep typing, if that makes sense. So it's something that I think, you know, I move into as opposed to it being something that sort of descends upon me. There are exceptions. Like sometimes you get once every 2 years I get a gift story and it feels like transcription and it's amazing. But it doesn't happen for me that often. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I would begin at what I think is the beginning so we're going to get very circular here, what I think is the beginning when I'm starting out. So I begin with what I imagine will be an opening scene, but, you know, very often you write the whole thing and you realize, you know, my opening is really on page 4, or my opening is, you know, it doesn't exist yet, and I sort of need to reconfigure how I'm entering into the story. I mean, I think the opening of a work of fiction, you know, even the opening paragraph, but certainly the opening scene, I mean, it really should hold sort of the DNA for the whole thing in there. And sometimes we don't really know what that trajectory is going to look like, that arc is going to look like, until we've created an entire draft. Well, I mean, I think reading is, reading change, though I came to it later than probably many of you did. Reading changed my life. So, I mean, I feel like I'm only a writer because I read something that moved me. And in that sense, the two are completely bound for me. And so I feel like, having a consistent and deep diving reading practice is totally part of my writing practice, and one can't exist without the other. And if I'm not showing up for my reading practice, I see it in the work. That to loop back to your question about inspiration, I mean, there's a lack of inspiration, there's a lack of energy, like there's a lack of sort of ideas sometimes. So for me, they don't necessarily feel like two separate but tracks that are moving in parallel, but rather two tracks that are really intertwined with one another. And I think in terms of how I think of reading when I'm actually doing this sort of the physical act of writing, I mean, influence, there's direct influence that we're conscious of and we're responding to, but then there's also influence that's sort of more unconscious, that's happening on that kind of subliminal level. But I do think, I can totally think of moments where I was moved to sort of be in conversation with a particular text, and that sort of was the impetus for writing something new. Are some of you in writing workshops or have taken writing workshops here? Yes? Maybe, yes, okay, I see some nods. So yeah, I think it's this kind of paradoxical thing sometimes where craft essay, That Crafty Feeling, which is wonderful, and you can find it online if you're interested, by Zadie Smith. I mean, she talks about how when she gets to sort of the proof stage, because then it's fixed, she feels this like immediate and overwhelming sort of like revulsion at what she's done, and just like can't even look at it. And it's just like, I trust the copy editor that they haven't done something like bonkers with my commas, and just sort of sends it off into the world. But yeah, no, I don't really think about a reader. I love what John Edgar Wideman says. I love that John Edgar Wideman quote where you think about maybe the conversation that you're trying to have. You think about sort of the writers that you want to be in conversation with, the places that you want to be in conversation with. I mean, certainly for me, Florida is like, I totally want to be in conversation with at least my little square, my little patch of Florida. I think about people that I want to be in conversation with, even if they don't know that I want to be in conversation with them. I want to be in conversation with my sister, but my sister, she doesn't read, so I don't have to worry about answering for what I actually write. So so I think about it in the way that Wideman talks about it, totally, this idea that there's this sort of congress in your head, but I don't think about someone actually like physically picking it up and reading it, because that's like too upsetting. But I think in workshop, it's like you come to a workshop presumably because you want people to read your work and talk about it, and yet there's often this sort of collective horror that descends upon the class when the moment actually arrives, and you're like, oh wait, this is something that I wanted? Why? And then it passes, and it's fine. I discover everything while I'm writing. I don't know anything. I might know just like a tendril, if you think of a canvas, like a few strokes on a canvas. For me, tone is everything. If you think about sort of like turning, no one's using like this kind of radio anymore, but turning sort of like a dial on a radio, and you're like static. There's sound, but it's like not quite right. I think for me, the early drafts, it's so much about finding that tonal frequency. And then once you hit the tonal frequency, for me, then I start to see more and more and more of the story. But a lot of the kind of the sort of typing versus writing that I'm doing in the first draft is really about trying to find that tonal frequency, and then when I do, it's a game changer. But I really I know very little, and so the whole process of writing a first draft really is a process of discovery, which is the terror, the not knowing, right? Not knowing isn't always comfortable, but it's also so much of the joy too, that feeling that you're giving yourself a chance to sort of be surprised by what you might put on the page. There's, it's a case-by-case thing, right? So they're not rules, but I mean, I do sometimes, come upon a moment in a story where my thinking in some ways about the world the characters moving through, their relationships to other characters has just been, maybe it's sort of like foundationally flawed in some way that I need to better understand. Maybe it's been like a little bit lazy or a little bit unimaginative or not sufficiently imaginative, and there's some sort of there's a larger perspective of there's a recalibration of perspective that sort of needs to happen. Sometimes that idea of harder questions, that it need not always be so dramatic, right? Can be just a question about like, maybe this character needs more space in the story. Why isn't this person getting to talk? Why aren't they getting more space? Why is this other person getting so much space? But I think that another way of kind of framing that idea of harder questions is also, for me in a first draft, I'm a very intuitive writer, as you've probably gleaned. There's not that many writers work this way and it's really necessary for them, but for me, I don't outline, I don't plan, I don't storyboard. I'm just in the abyss until I write my way out of it, essentially. And so there are times where you go down sort of the wrong rabbit hole, and you need to kind of if we suspend the laws of gravity, you need to go back up through that rabbit hole and sort of find the right one, and find the sort of paths that you've accidentally gone down and need to backtrack. And I think a lot of it too is pushing yourself to understand, what is this story really about? Because very often we start writing with maybe a sense of aboutness, and then at some point our understanding of the story's own aboutness has to really shift in the making. So I can think of the idea of asking harder questions where it's been sort of smaller recalibrations, and then sometimes, particularly for novels, because there are more questions to ask in a novel, often that idea of asking the harder questions really was it was like a wrecking ball. I had to demolish the draft I had and then rebuild, which was not, all fun and games. But it was what the story sort of demanded of me at that moment. Yeah, well, I think that idea of mattering is, it's a little bit elusive, right? Because there's work that might matter deeply to me and feel like it says it's so insightful about the world, and it might not read the same to another person. So, owing that there's of course mattering, what moves us, right? It's I can't actually read the whole Transformer poem because it makes me. Maybe I should read it to my therapist so I can finally cry, but it makes me cry. But another person could hear it and be completely unmoved. But I think, there's a relationship between narrative and power, storytelling and power, right? It's power structures are a part of narrative, and I don't think it's not a bad thing. It's not anything to be sort of nervous about. Actually, I think it's an opportunity, right? So I think what I'm hoping to sort of gesture towards there is just a kind of collective awareness that narrative and power have a relationship. And if we are invested in sort of understanding that relationship and thinking about it as part of our storytelling practice, that's potentially a great asset to us as artists, right? And as people who are thinking about the world. So. But I think my approach is to sort of take, an individual character, and to think about, it's that Alexander Chee quote, also an interview you can read online, but I love that passage, that idea of, even if you're writing about just one person, right, just one person's experience in the world, you still have the opportunity to explore the sort of scheme that has built up around them, and their layers, their relational layers to their surroundings. And I think for all of us, it's so layered, it's complicated. We have arrows pointing in different directions, right? I don't think anyone's experience in the world can be sort of easily summed or easily approved of or dismissed. And so I think to approach our fictional characters with that same sort of interest, that same sort of curiosity, and that same sort of sense of lairness to think about, yeah, like what, even if it's just something that exists in the story, it's not part of the story's plot, it exists in the story at a completely subtextual level. What's their world like? You know, what do they do? What do they do for a living? How do they relate to the world? Like, all of those are human questions, and they're also, I think, political questions. And I think those are all sort of bound up together. And I think sometimes there's this, which is not so much the case in other parts of the world, there's this sense that we want to like parcel them out, to sort of say like, oh, political fiction is this sort of whole category of fiction, and then there's everything else. Whereas if we just think about it as, you know, it's like all knotted up in the whole like mess of being a person. And so that's my approach, and I hope, you know, the hope is you create work that can speak to the individual and also sort of the human collective in some way. Thank you.